From WABE in Atlanta, this is Savory Stories, a show where we take a look at Atlanta's people through its cuisine and food history.
On this podcast, we trace Atlanta's food story from the past to the present, getting to know Atlanta's culinary creators and demystifying stereotypes about food.
I'm Akila McConnell, culinary historian and owner of Unexpected Atlanta Tours, the #1 rated Atlanta tour and activity on TripAdvisor, and author of A Culinary History of Atlanta.
And I'm Chef Asata Reed, owner of Life Chef, where we help you live a life you love, and author of How to Feed a Kid, a Parent's Guide. Today, we're talking about the topic that's on everyone's mind in 2024, and that is the presidential election. But you know that we're not politicians, so we're looking at the elections through the lens of drinks.
This is a companion podcast to our story on election foods, so check that one out as well. But today, we're talking about alcohol and the other alternatives that fuels an election.
Look, this year, I think everybody feels like they need a drink, given all the drama in politics, in the world, in the climate, in the you name it, right?
Absolutely.
But alcohol, whether it's cocktails, wine, or beer, or non-alcoholic alternatives like juice and water, have always played a role in our elections and voting process.
That's right. And it's actually emphasized in that classic pollster question. I don't know if you all are into the polls like I am. I'm a little obsessed with them. But there is this classic pollster question, which is, with which candidate would you rather have a beer? The question is meant to provide information on how voters perceive a combination of likability and authenticity. And the question actually works. For example, in 2000, you might remember that election. That was the hanging Chad, George W. Bush, Al Gore debacle. So George W. Bush actually won the beer question in polling, though Al Gore won nearly every other poll. As we know, Bush ended up winning the election, and some people believed that it was simply because Bush was more authentic and likable, as seen in the answer to the beer question.
Even since student council government back in school, it's always been about likability, relatability, and this is still true.
Yeah, and this is from a food history perspective, very fascinating, because President George W. Bush was a noted non-drinker, famously sober since 1986.
How ironic.
Right. But despite the fact that you actually would never have had a beer with him, people thought of him as the type of person with whom you could drink a beer. And this story really explains the way in which alcohol and how and what candidates drink help us relate to them.
Yeah, I remember you saying something similar in the election foods episode, that candidates use food to help them connect to the public at large.
That's right. But with drinks, it's a little bit more sordid.
No, not the sordid history.
So we're taking a little bit of a deeper dive into this one. Let's back it up. I'll also bring in the Atlanta connection. Now, in the election foods episode, so go listen to that one if you haven't yet, I shared about the early history of treating, but here is a quick refresher. In the 1700s and 1800s, it was expected that candidates would provide food and alcohol to convince people to come out to vote. This practice was known as treating.
And as you described in the previous episode, voters took being treated very seriously, like to the tune of gallons of alcohol per person.
That's right. An important thing to remember here is that in pre-Civil War America, the only ones permitted to vote were white men. And so polling stations were not in the places that you might expect. They were in places only frequented by men, meaning tobacco shops and saloons. So, Asata, I just want you to imagine you go to your local bar to vote.
Right. I mean, I guess they had to bring the politics to where the people were.
It's right. That's right. That's exactly right. And these saloons were solely male spheres. They were often the largest buildings in town. And so, for example, the very first election in Atlanta, that election was held at Thomas Kyle's grocery store, which also doubled as a saloon. Now, voting in that time period, this was a huge party full of drunkards. The politicians would ply their constituents with alcohol to convince them to vote for them. And I've actually put into the show notes an 1857 political cartoon showing two politicians trying to buy votes using alcohol. But as you can imagine, it became very fraught as it resulted in voter fraud, voter intimidation, and bribery.
Yeah, none of that sounds legal. Not to mention that intoxicated voters would be a whole lot easier to influence.
Yeah, and saloon keepers actually took advantage of that. They used to have burly men standing by to ensure that on election day, constituents voted for the, quote, right candidate.
Just lean on them a little bit.
Lean on them a little bit. That's right. Or if someone walked into a saloon and was planning on voting for the, quote, wrong candidate, then he might be plied with alcohol until he changed his mind. And I also want you to remember that in the early elections, those elections were not anonymous votes. So people knew who you were going to be voting for, and there was a whole lot of leaning being done.
I wonder how many people, speaking of leaning, were also just being propped up.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and to kind of extend on this, there was this truly awful practice known as cooping. And this is going to sound like one of those things that I have made up because it is just so bizarre. But I promise you, this is an actual fact. There is a huge amount of evidence that this was done in the United States. So the concept of cooping was that these gangs in the saloon, they would kidnap an unsuspecting voter.
What?
I swear to you, they would force them to drink excessively or to take drugs, usually opium.
Oh, this gets worse and worse.
And then the constituent would be disguised in various clothing and taken to multiple voting booths to cast their vote multiple times. It's actually believed that the very famous poet Edgar Allan Poe was a victim of cooping.
Oh, way.
Yeah, because he was found dead in strange clothes that were not his own on Election Day in front of Gunner's Hall and Tavern in Baltimore, which was a polling location.
Oh, my gosh.
Cooping was, of course, highly illegal. Nobody knows exactly how Poe died, but this is considered the most convincing possibility.
Girl, I am clutching my pearls. That's not included in our high school American civics class.
This is important history to know. Asata, I think I've made the point that it is well established that every man was drinking during Election Day in the 1800s. And I say man because, of course, women were not allowed to vote. Mm-hmm. In fact, women were told to stay at home.
Yeah, because it sounds like a very dangerous day to be out and about.
Exactly. Yeah. So on Election Day, women were told stay at home. But here in Atlanta, as is so often the case, there also was a racial element at play. So post-Civil War, Black men are granted the right to vote in limited numbers here in Atlanta, and they take opportunity of that. They also are going to these saloons to vote because that is the polling location. But in 1902, a white Atlanta reverend argued for prohibition laws to be enacted in Atlanta when he saw on Election Day, and I quote, this is a direct quote from the newspaper article that he wrote in, irresponsible Black voters rallied by the liquor gang and driven like sheep to the polls, singing ribald songs. Others responded that this was a reason to disenfranchise all Black voters, arguing that Black voters were too irresponsible, and I quote, to be given the right to vote.
So just so I'm clear, this is perfectly acceptable behavior in white men to get loaded and go to the polls, but when it came to Black voters, of course, a double standard was expected.
Exactly. And this becomes a real sticking point here in Atlanta. After the Atlanta Race Massacre, the city passes prohibition laws, which I've talked about in our beer episode, and Atlanta becomes the first major city in the United States to go dry long before national prohibition. We stayed dry for nearly 32 years.
Wow.
But even after Prohibition ended, the vestiges of alcohol bans remained. And as you might remember, in Georgia, alcohol sales were prohibited on Sundays, even in restaurants, until very recently.
Yeah, it was 2011 when the laws changed, and you can even buy alcohol on Sundays in Georgia.
Yeah, but with relation to our topic on election drinks, for a very long time, alcohol sales were banned on election days, a Tuesday, across the country. The Georgia legislature overturned that ban in 1986.
1986.
That is right.
It's like 5 minutes ago.
Yeah, it is. Close to Taylor Swift's age. Right. So, Taylor Swift, 1989. 1986 becomes the first election in which liquor stores and bars could sell alcoholic beverages since Prohibition in Georgia. By the way, South Carolina was the last state to ban alcohol sales on Election Day, and that was overturned in 2014.
Wow.
Just 10 years ago, not that long ago.
Right. And I never really realized that alcohol sales on election days was prohibited. And then just as recently as the 1980s? Come on, that's wild.
It is. But, despite this increased acceptance now that we're starting to see, candidates have to be very, very careful about how they use alcohol. There's this growing acceptance that is occurring in alcohol culture. And I think a big part of that reason is due to Georgia's very own Jimmy Carter.
Wait a minute. Now, I associate President Carter, our homegrown president, with peanuts. He was a peanut farmer from Plains, Georgia. How's he associated with alcohol?
Yeah, so I've mentioned before that Prohibition really changed the way in which people in the United States drank. And one of the major ways that occurred was that after Prohibition, the United States government banned home brewing.
Ooh.
So it makes sense when you think about it, because one of the major reasons that Prohibition ended was that government realized that by taxing alcohol heavily, they could earn some much needed extra revenue for the government. So they didn't want to give up that extra revenue by letting homebrewers make their own version. Well, when Carter became president in 1976, there were less than 100 breweries operating in the entire United States because there was this restrictive ban on who could brew beer.
That makes sense, because when I think about, my childhood back in the 70s and 80s, there was only like a handful of beers. There was Miller, Coors, and Budweiser. And there just wasn't like as many varieties of beer available.
Yeah, think about, when was the first time you heard the word microbrew?
Probably in the 90s.
90s, 2000s.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think I heard the word microbrew until the 2000s.
We should look that one up and see when Webster added it to the dictionary.
It is. But Jimmy Carter in 1978, 1979, he was a huge fan of supporting small businesses. So this actually was one of the cores of his economic policy, was deregulating industries, opening up industries for competition. So in 1979, he deregulated the beer industry and he allowed home brewing, and he opened up this concept of craft brewers. So between the 80s to the 2000s, slowly and slowly, craft brewing becomes a thing. But by 2009, the Brewers Association trade groups estimated that 90% of craft brewers, they started their business by making beer at home. And that's because Carter lifted this ban on home brewing. Today we have this explosion of craft breweries. Georgia alone has over 150 breweries. So imagine in 1980, there were 100 breweries in the whole country. Today, just Georgia has 150.
Yeah, it really feels like you could throw a rock and hit a microbrewery.
Exactly. I will tell you, there is a legacy of prohibition that exists to this day. We still have a federal ban on distilling spirits at home.
I did not know that. A federal ban. And, we're going to have to do an episode on moonshine, because Georgia has such a history to the illegal brewing of spirits. And I have a family connection there, actually. It's going to be a fun story to throw in there.
Okay, well, I'm excited for that one because I think moonshine is super interesting. But you want to hear something really funny?
Yeah.
Even though Jimmy Carter is considered opening up the door to craft brewing, there are actually several craft breweries that have done Jimmy Carter inspired beers, like a thank you, Mr. Carter, thank you, President Carter beers. he actually did not drink any alcohol during his time in the White House. He emptied the White House of all spirits while he was there.
That was a big move.
Yeah, so that was partially because his brother, Billy Carter, had a problem with alcohol.
Yes.
And Billy became the face of a popular 1980s beer called Billy Beer. So craft brewing, like we just talked about, didn't become much of a thing until the 2000s. And President Obama plays a role in craft brewing becoming even bigger, more accepted.
And immediately that calls to mind that episode of Anthony Bourdain's Parts Unknown, where Bourdain and Obama shared beers over this tiny table in Hanoi. It's an iconic photo. It's an iconic moment of that beer with the president vibe you were talking about earlier.
Exactly. So in 2012, inspired by home brewers, President Obama bought a home brewing kit using his own personal funds, which I think is a great little note. Like, can you imagine him going out to like the website of some little brewer and typing in Barack Obama and putting in his credit card? So he uses his own personal funds to buy a home brewing kit for the White House kitchen. The White House chefs brewed up batches of White House Honey Brown Ale and White House Honey Porter made from the honey tapped from the first ever beehives built on the South Lawn, another Michelle Obama project.
Mm-hmm.
I've put in the show notes a quick video with the White House chefs talking about the process of making the batches as well as recipes for the beer. There's also a picture of President Obama toasting with a nice mug of their own ale.
That is so like cute and special. Like, oh, we've got bees, we've got honey, we've got beer. I love that.
Yeah, but again, this is this moment of connecting with the people.
Mm-hmm.
He's trying to connect with this moment of home brewing when craft brewing was becoming a really big thing. He's also trying to connect with the people by being somebody that you could share a beer with. By the way, President George Washington did brew beer and distill whiskey at Mount Vernon. It is also believed that President Thomas Jefferson brewed his own beer as well at Monticello. But the big question, I know you all are thinking, well, how did the White House beer taste? Unfortunately, they did not make enough to become a national product. But in a Reddit Q&A in 2012, President Obama called it, and I quote, tasty. So there you have it.
He strikes me as the kind of guy that as long as it was cold, it was going to be somewhere in the realm of good. I remember the home wine brewing movement back in the late 80s because my parents were part of it. And I'll never forget that one day they had a young batch of mulberry wine, and because we had this crazy prolific mulberry tree. But it exploded. And that stain of mulberry wine on the ceiling was there until we moved out of that house. Today, there's still spots in Atlanta dedicated to supporting those who want to craft brew. And you can find places like Brew Depot and the Wine Workshop, where you'll find all the supplies, knowledgeable staff, and like-minded crafters that you need to create your own beer, wine, well, maybe not spirits, at home.
No spirits, but you can certainly craft that beer and wine at home. But between President Obama to today, there hasn't been a lot of drinking alcohol at the White House. And that is because both President Trump and President Biden do not drink any alcohol, in both cases because they had family members who were negatively impacted by alcohol. That being said, they do both have a favorite beverage. I don't know if you've heard about this, Asata, but President Trump is a Diet Coke fanatic.
Really?
He reportedly drinks 12 Diet Cokes every single day. That's so much Diet Coke.
A lot of Diet Coke.
So reportedly, I don't know if this is actually true, but this is the report, is he had a Diet Coke button installed in the Oval Office so that Diet Cokes would be brought up whenever he pressed it. He is not the first president, by the way, to have a button in his office. President Gerald Ford had a Fresca button in his office.
Fresca?
So, that was a thing.
Okay.
President Biden, on the other hand, he prefers orange Gatorade.
Wait, who prefers orange? I mean, you drink it because you have to.
I know. But, he is really in shape. So,
yeah.
He is a...
It's the champagne for athletes, right?
It is the champagne for athletes, and maybe that's what it is. Here in Atlanta, when Stacey Abrams ran for governor, her drink of choice was a Shirley Temple because she also doesn't drink alcohol. So, Asata, let's say that Tuesday night, you are watching the election, you are not an alcohol drinker. What would your drink of choice be? And let's try and find some local flavors, please.
Okay. Now, first, I have to say that all of that you just previously mentioned sounds just sweet and activates my ick button. But to each their own. I know people who hate flavored seltzers and sparkling waters, but honestly, that's my go-to for refreshment. So Gen Z in particular has promoted this sober curious movement, and I get all these ads in Instagram asking, are you sober curious? And that has given us some amazing mocktails, which are more than just sparkling juice drink. So let's check out Southern Belle and her sister restaurant, which you love, Georgia Boy.
I do.
For mocktails that leave you wanting nothing. Also, Vesper in Glenwood Park definitely deserves a nod for a deep list on James Bond-inspired non-alcoholic cocktails that are just as nuanced and sophisticated as their alcoholic counterparts, thanks to alcohol-free spirits by Ritual. Akila, have you had a chance to try their zero-proof spirits by Ritual?
I have not, but I have to tell you, I really love sparkling waters, so I'm a huge fan of Spindrift, but I also love Georgia's own Montaigne.
Yes.
If you haven't tried theirs, they have a honeysuckle sparkling water that is just like summer in a can. It's so delicious.
It is.
Highly recommend Montaigne sparkling water. So let's flip it and talk about some of the candidates and some of the folks that prefer alcohol. So Vice President Kamala Harris, she has her own interesting drink choices. Now, going back to that beer question that we talked about at the top of this episode, on October 9th, 2024, Stephen Colbert had Kamala Harris on his show, and he said, and I quote, "One of the old saws is that people just want to have a president they can have a beer with. So will you have a beer with me?" And while she's laughing, Harris and Colbert made waves as they cracked open cans of Miller High Life. Her choice, by the way, and they chatted about foreign policy while tasting the champagne of beer, as she said on the show.
That's right. Miller High Life, the champagne of beer.
That's right. So I have to tell you also, as a nod to her California roots, Vice President Harris, she loves white wine, but she drinks it over ice.
She likes it cold.
She likes it cold.
I can understand that because she's in the lights so often, and your wine's gonna get warm. It's inevitable.
Ooh, that's an interesting point I hadn't thought of. I was like, doesn't it water it
down?
Does. But yeah, if you've got those lights on you, you're always sitting in the spotlight. And then probably she only gets to take like one sip at every 30 minutes because somebody's talking to her. And if we're talking locally, Governor Brian Kemp's drink of choice is a ice cold Budweiser, not a Bud Light ever. Let's start with some beers. What are your choices for an election night where it's probably going to be a late night? We're all going to be biting our nails waiting for results. What beers are you drinking?
I want to go where the local beers are on tap. So in my neck of the woods, that means I'm watching the poll results over at Monday Night Brewery, Best In Brewery, or Halfway Crooks. What local breweries are you haunting on election night?
So I'm going to be in my PJs watching because I cannot be seen on election night. Like, I am a nervous wreck, y'all. I am a nervous wreck. My husband's always sitting by me like, chill out.
Breathe.
It's going to be fine. Breathe. And I'm like yelling at the television. So I cannot be seen in public. But
so politics is your sports ball.
It is my sports ball. That is right. But if I was a normal human, I would go to Twain's because first off, it's just a great setting. Tons of TVs.
Yes.
You know they're going to have everything on and such great beers.
Love Twain's. Love the owners. I used to wait tables there 100 years ago.
Oh, that's great. Yeah. That was the first bar in Atlanta that I ever went to that had a non-smoking section. election night, what are some wine or cocktail choices?
Okay, if you're going to seriously sip, I suggest you make a stop by Lucian Books and Wine for an elevated experience, because who don't like books, okay? Kimball House in Decatur always takes their cocktails and wine list seriously. And the Ticaranda Club at the Krog Street Market, their cocktails are ever-changing and enticing, especially if you have a sophisticated palate. They like to play with their drinks. Drinks here are fun and delicious. But I want to give a shout out to some OGs who've been slinging some wine and cocktails for a while, and that would be Après Diem and Cafe Intermezzo. They've just been giving date night some sophistication for decades.
Okay, so let's say that you're not me and you can stand to be around people on election night. Where do you go if you need a community to keep you company on election night?
Manuel's Tavern. That's just like, you're going to be around like-minded people. On election night, that's why they're there.
Yeah.
But I remember having a fantabulous night with dear friends at Bacchanalia back when Clinton was voted in for round one. So in this case, I think it's who you're with more than where you are.
I like that a lot. So as a reminder, no matter what you drink, the most important thing is to go out and vote and make your voice heard.
That's right.
Thanks again, and we will see you in a few weeks with another episode.
Savory Stories is produced by Crystal Devon with additional production and editing from Scotty Crow. The series was created by Summer Evans and premiered on City Lights with Lois Reitzitz. For more info, visit wabe.org/Savory Stories.
WABE.